Hey, fellow GNTers, those of us who like our spirituality with a twist. So, for this episode, we were doing things on Karma Mudra, but one of the things we're interested in doing is if we get a question from a listener that seems really interesting, we want to like reply and sometimes do episodes around things that people point out. It's kind of an ongoing plan. So, we happen to have a good one, and we thought we would take a little time within our Karma Mudra series to talk about this particular question. So, I don't know, do you want to do the question, Daniel, or do you want me to try to walk through it?
Um, you could walk through it. You can walk through it.
Okay. I mean, I tried to give it a good read, and you can tell me if you think there's parts that should be added in. As I read the email from the listener who said, "Hey, if you could answer this or maybe chat about it a little bit during an episode,"
Yeah, yeah.
um, he kind of like to me, it's kind of read in a couple of parts. One part was kind of like him asking, "What about words like pleasure, ecstasy, bliss? What are those about? And are those the same thing, or are there, differences between them?" So maybe there's something to say about that. And I tried to
Mhm.
do a little, project of just seeing if I could frame some of the semantics around that. And we'll do the best we can of doing what we can with it in true Jin and Tantra style. And then
Mhm.
the other one I got was sort of his idea of like, well, so if there is bliss, what is the role of that? What does that mean? Is that like a byproduct of spiritual practice, or is it something that you use as a tool, or kind of where does it fit? So I guess the big question is about these ideas of pleasure, bliss, and then he uses the
Yeah,
word
well, but
ecstasy too.
he also asked like specifically, he's like, are they a key to enlightenment, or are they a path towards it, or are they a
I think
secondary,
that, I
are
think,
they
yeah, I think I
a
was trying to say that
byproduct?
in different words or something, right? That same
Yeah,
idea, right?
yeah, yeah.
Like, where does it fit in? Is it a tool? Is it a intrinsic part of the path, right? What was the third one you said? Is it a byproduct, or is it essential? Is that the
Yeah,
idea
he
there?
said, is
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is it a master key? Is it on the path, or is it a nice secondary effect of, as he put it, walking the way towards enlightenment, which is a very eloquent way of stating it.
Yeah, that's very nice. Okay, so we'll take a tumble at it.
Yeah.
I'll go through. I tried to do a little bit on the semantics of this because, we have these kind of trio of words out there, pleasure, ecstasy, and bliss. And I thought, well, maybe one of the things to do is just kind of look at like the kinds of words that are used sort of in the sources for these kind of things that we're trying to present. So maybe
Hmm.
to go back and look a little bit at the language. And, my home base is going to be more in like the Tibetan Buddhist world, but a lot of these words are kind of out there. And it's good to have a sense of sort of what they are and what they might mean overall. So I'll throw it out to you. You can tell me what you think as you go.
Yeah.
But the one
Yeah.
that popped out to me that you might have more to say initially, even than I do, would be the sort of sat-chit-ananda idea, right?
Hmm.
Which is, that kind of trio of words. So I was like, okay, well, what would be one of the words that would be pleasure, bliss, or ecstasy? And I thought of ananda, right?
Hmm.
And that word ananda shows up as bliss, but in these sort of trio of words, they're not used as much in like the Tibetan Buddhist tantric context, but of course they're big words in Indian
Yeah.
culture, right?
Yeah.
Especially relating back to Brahma. So Sat has more this idea. Again, I'll be curious what you say about this too, Daniel, but I think of that as sort of like being in the existential sense, reality
Hmm.
and being and truth, right?
Hmm.
But being maybe in a philosophical sense, like the ground of reality or something, is more sought. And then chit being more like the meaning of consciousness.
Yeah.
And then ananda having more of that meaning of like bliss or ecstasy or something like that.
Hmm.
Right. And then these get kind of tied into, I guess, the most profound experience of the divine, you might say. If you're
Yes.
talking about like Brahma, it would be the direct experience of Brahma or something,
Hmm.
where from a certain point of view, you feel. Now, it's interesting because Sat is sort of like just being in reality itself, kind of with the idea that everything is kind of Brahma or something. At least that's the way I think about it. Or everything is like divine energy.
Yeah.
That I think
Divine energy. Yeah.
really vibes well with how I would think of, Buddhist Tantra things and stuff like that. I think that's
Hmm.
maybe you wouldn't personify that. You wouldn't maybe call that a divinity like a Brahma or something. But I certainly can relate to that idea. And then, chit being sort of like the experience of your own consciousness and your own awareness of this, right?
Yeah.
And then Ananda being sort of the bliss of experiencing this ground of being and the ground of who you are kind of uniting together or something.
Hmm.
You Do you fuck with that way of talking
Yeah.
about it?
Yeah, I'm fucking with that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, it's like the experience, so sat, if we're gonna just take a little detour here and do sat-chit-ananda, sat is like the experience of your authentic self. So the
Yeah, I heard it that way too, which is interesting. I haven't always heard it that way, but I like that. Just
and so
not
and
to
so
butt in, but yeah, I like it.
I'm
Uh-huh.
gonna use the Tibetan word for yogin, which is Naljor, which we've
Hmm.
talked about on here before. And Naljor, the one of the definitions that I like for it. Now, maybe this is incorrect. If it is, I don't care. I like it. I'm using it anyways. It's
Hmm.
one who establishes and maintains the authentic state of mind. So
Hmm.
this is like a practitioner of something that is able to not only um, generate or establish this kind of clear mind, right? But then they're also able to maintain it. And this is the practice. So the practice is the building and the maintaining of. So this is the kind of like sat part is that you are in this sort of space of who you are, right?
Hmm.
This kind of I don't know how to say it, like no ID, your identification is sort of lacking specificity for those moments, and then the chit is the mind, obviously, but it's the conscious part of your mind that is like seeing reality around you, not just for the mundane uh accumulation of bouncy balls, right? But as the kind of potential field of possibility that is, like you said, that is Brahma, that is divine energy, that is the potentiality before it becomes something more gross, right? You're able to be in that kind of a field, you know? And then Ananda, yeah, like this is the experience of all of this simultaneously, like the that part is the first two combined together. So as you're
Hmm.
in the act of you doing that, you're experiencing it's a blissful state for you to be in. And we haven't talked about it, and I don't think we should go too deep into it now because it will take us down another 12-minute rabbit hole. But it's kind of like the three bodies uh in the Buddhist,
I guess you could see it within that way. Dharmakaya, Sambhogakaya, and
in
Nirmanakaya for
Nirmanakaya.
people who've listened to previous episodes of us blah blah blahing about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
a little bit in this way, because you're
Yeah.
talking
Yeah.
about pleasure, you're talking
So
about reality, and you're talking about consciousness and whatnot. So,
so when like when the listener brought up Ananda, I was like, oh yeah, yeah. Then so that's a thing to bring up, this sit chat Ananda. I
hmm
hadn't heard the sat part being talked about the authentic self, or maybe you'd say Atman or something with that, if you want to
sure.
be that way.
Yeah.
I've somehow got that more emphasized in my mind, and I claim no, like again, I'm more coming from the Tibetan Buddhist world
Yeah.
than the
This is
language that
far.
this would
Yeah.
be used, but I still find it fascinating, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've more thought of it as like Brahma itself or like being itself. Just as a little sidebar point, one of the things I did read with this sort of as the core is, and I'm just going to throw his name out for people who might be interested in like a cool read. So there's a guy named David Bentley Hart. He's actually an Orthodox Greek practitioner, but he's not from like Greek descent. And he seemed to have converted over into this Orthodoxy from maybe being like Presbyterian or something.
Mm.
But the backstory for me was he wrote this book called The Experience of God. And he's a real smart ass writer. So I enjoy that kind of thing. And he was particular, Daniel, like targeting like the new atheists back in the day, like the people that were that kind of explosion of new atheists kind
Mm.
of, they were smart asses too, so they deserved a smart ass reply. So this would be like the Christopher Hitchens and the Richard Dawkins of the world,
Yeah.
if
Yeah. I
those
was going to say
think about the
Dawkins. Yeah.
people, Dawkins,
hmm
and there was this really aggressive form of atheism, which always annoyed me
Yeah.
because it was so smart-assy and it was so dismissive of everything else. I didn't care for it that much. Personals, I understand that they were fighting against orthodoxy in some ways, and I guess I can appreciate that. But in any case, I was in France, I was in Paris, and in the first arrondissement, they had like an English-speaking bookstore, like maybe it's the Shakespeare Book Company or something. And I stumbled across this book in Paris, and then like kind of like one of those things where it kind of jumped off the shelf, The Experience of God. What the hell is this? And the subtitle on it was Sit Chat Ananda. So I think I was really influenced in somewhat the way he was talking about that too. So if people want to read, there's a read that's kind of
Sure.
good. And he's a genuine smartass.
Sure.
You can kind of do a little bit of YouTube searching on him,
Hmm.
and he's definitely like he's funny, right? So I guess in that sense, I always thought of Sat as sort of like being, but I could also see you could talk about Atman or something like that.
Sure. Sure.
And what, like you see like yourself as like an aspect of Brahma or something. Is that a right way to put that, you think? Or co-equivalent or something?
Yeah, that I could, I don't, that I'm not sure. I mean, if again, I'm using the Tibetan correlate of like one who is establishing their own authentic state. So whatever you're doing
Mhm.
in order to get that is going to be dependent upon your particular practice. So like if you are, finding yourself, I'm just thinking of an audience member who is not into the kind of Tibetan thing, like if you're finding yourself in a state of prayer or connecting, yeah, we'll just say prayer because all religious practices have prayer in them. So if you're in a very kind of connected state during prayer, that, your sense of self is dissolved in the act of devotion, that like you can move beyond limitations that you might have upon yourself. You know what I'm saying? And you feel like this connection with the larger sense of divinity all around you, the pervasive sense of divinity, so that you can like, how do you say, like transcend your own beingness in a self. You merge with all 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 of reality, essentially, a larger, even if a sense of it, of physical expansiveness, if we're gonna go that route. um that then that becomes, that you can use that as a thing. So then how do you see yourself? I don't know, because those people they're not visualizing that I'm aware of anything there. You're in a state of prayer, but you could totally get to these kinds of places, I believe, in prayer, if you're regularly practicing and conscious of your breath and whatever.
I mean, the thing that speaks to me, and we'll get to the Ananda part of it too, right? Because that's the, in the question, but
Yeah.
I like kind of feel like on the one hand, if you say authentic self, you're getting to something, like a Buddha nature idea or something like
Sure.
that inside of yourself, right? If you start talking about all being, you're kind of talking about not you, but you're kind of talking about like the whole shebang, right?
Yeah.
And then maybe feeling that connection between all of this stuff. So I think there's something to be said about, do you feel this to be your authentic self? If we funnel that through where, well, I'm going to try to take this in the future, then you're feeling your own Buddha nature or something, the
Mm,
core of your own being. If you're
mm,
talking about like being overall in the big sense, and this David Bentley Hart makes a big deal about this,
okay.
what is everything around you? Well, it's divinity. So then you're
Right.
getting to something that isn't just like the core of who you are, but like kind of the hidden reality of everything is kind of like that.
Mm,
And I think, then when you get to the Ananda part, like to realize that is kind of blissful, right? So
mm-hmm,
that's a certain kind of bliss that has a certain function or something. I
mm-hmm.
guess that's an experience. I mean, so we'll kind of try to build on this to try to get to
Yes.
the answer for the
Yeah, yeah,
question,
yeah.
but that's kind of like an end or goal state or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well,
And like intricately locked in the experience. You wouldn't just say sat chit and you wouldn't leave the ananda out, because without the ananda, that's not the complete experience, right?
yeah.
Part of the experience intrinsically is a kind of an ananda, a bliss feeling.
So
It's part of that.
I don't have your notes in front of me, but
Yeah,
we'll see. So we're recording live, and sometimes we share notes and other times we don't, because it's fun not to. But
yeah.
I'm just I'm wondering if you have this written down or if you've thought about it. Is the experience of bliss, and this is part of the question, is it inherent in the experience of merging with the infinite, or, and I don't mean to put it in a binary way, or on the other side, but on the other side of the coin, is there the faith that being in that state is blissful? Do you understand what I'm
So
saying?
being in that state of being united with all of this stuff is blissful.
Yeah. So is that inherent? Is that an inherent quality of that state, right? So once you're so in that state, it's blissful. Or
Yeah,
on
yeah.
the other side, do you have to be blissful in order to get into that state?
I think I do have this shit in the notes.
I figured you did. I figured you did
And
because
I tried to look at it from both angles, you
okay,
know?
okay, okay,
And for
good. All right.
me, the trippy part, and maybe a nice synchronicity with this listener's question, is like this was the kind of stuff I was dealing with in my last retreat.
Oh, okay.
When I had over the break, I was wondering about these exact things. So okay, we'll do a slow hand here. We'll do a slow build
Yeah.
to
Well,
get
and
to it. But like, yeah, I think that's both. There's something to both of those things, right?
Eric, I know like so by the time that this episode gets published, it's probably going to be right. In fact, I'll make sure that I publish it right before the election. You,
Okay.
you know what I'm saying? So we are
Uh-huh.
not doing this in a bubble, right? This again, we say numerous times, it's not a political podcast. We say that Eric because both Eric and I are definitely like to keep up with all the happenings because it's like, I don't know, it's a weird, not healthy obsession. Not obsession, but like interest, I guess that's probably a better way of putting it. Um, but we don't operate in a vacuum. We're both we have our own beliefs. We have a lot of things that we believe together. But what I'm saying all this so that like people who are listening and people probably know us by now, but I just want to acknowledge that like we are people in this world, we are people of this world, we are people for this world. You know what I'm saying? And so as we're talking about these things, we're also practicing these things. We're also trying to teach these things, or about better yet, share these things. And we cannot remove ourselves from our surroundings, in this way. And so even though there's kind of madness kind of happening all around us, and from all the things that are happening all over the world simultaneously right now, right? And what's going on in here, the divisiveness, all the election season and all that other shit, you know, this is still people's responsibility anyways. I believe, if
To pursue this kind of spirituality.
yes,
Yeah, okay. Yeah, yeah,
yes.
I'm down with that.
Yeah. And so the driving factor, and one of the answers to the question is this here. You cannot, I don't believe there are very few people, and Eric's a very disciplined person. I'm a very disciplined person. Discipline alone cannot get you over the hump. It just cannot. But if you find something that's worth repeating, maybe something that's pleasurable, then maybe that can get you closer, or at least you can hump a little bit more. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah. The hump to
there,
get over the hump. It's
there,
a pun.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, you wanted to acknowledge the fact that, okay, we're sitting here talking about bliss and talking about these things, and there's a lot of chaos going on in the world, but that isn't in the context of being blind to those things. It's just this
Correct.
is what happens. And like
Correct.
probably we haven't done a thing on EQ, the great Japanese poet and Zen master specifically, but in some of his poems, there's a lot of funky shit going on in Japan when he's writing, and he has poems where like shit's going bad, but he still has to keep on keeping on
Yeah.
in this thing. So yeah, I get what you mean. We're not being blind to those things, especially if you're sitting talking about bliss at a time when there's so much funky shit going on. You don't want to be like you're, being indifferent to that or something.
No, yeah,
I
no, we're
don't think
not.
that's it. No, it's not being indifferent. It's maybe with the hope that spiritual practice transforms us as individuals and maybe also trickles out, starts to make a little bit better stuff in the world. I mean, you keep your fingers crossed on it,
That's the hope.
bodhisattva way of life or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, we got to let the people who are doing what they're doing do it, on some level.
Yeah. Okay. So I think part of the thing was just looking at this word ananda, right?
Hmm.
And trying to see what they say about that. So that's one of the words you get that helps the listener out. That's one of the words that they use for bliss. And then it is part of this famous trio, right? Which gets described as this very ultimate bliss that I think is intrinsically entwined with like experiencing the nature of reality.
Yeah.
And I'll
Yeah.
make the argument, I think, from when we get to like sort of the Tibetan stuff too, that I think that is the case, that the
Yeah.
experience of reality has a bliss to it kind of at the core. And
Yeah.
so then it would be necessary to experience that somehow, right?
Hmm.
So that's kind of maybe that part. The other word that pops up a lot is sukha, So I've looked up that one too, just to
Mm-hmm.
see, because it struck me as like the listener was saying, hey, there's these different kinds of words. And I thought, well, let's trace these back to some of the source language things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sukha is one of the other big words, and it means things like happiness, pleasure, joy. What's kind of interesting about this, and I don't know, this is a little embarrassing, but it never clicked for me before, but it's kind of the opposite of dukkha.
It is the opposite of dukkha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that ever really fully resonated with me in that
Oh,
way. I must have heard it before, but I don't know. It is the
yeah.
opposite of dukkha.
Yeah.
So,
They
the
talk.
unsatisfactoriness, the dukkha part, and then the sukha part, right?
Yeah, they talk about this
The
since like
sweetness.
many like yoga teacher trainings, which is how I'm, familiar with it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know if they always make a huge point in like the Lamrim about that, but and what I also like found interesting about it is it's kind of like literally translates as good or bad space. So dukkha means like bad space,
Mm-hmm.
and sukha means like good space. So interesting in the semantics of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is not necessarily my way of thinking about this, but I thought I would just share if this speaks to the listener at all, because I think he was asking, are there like stages or levels of this? And that seemed to be a kind of an important part of his question too. Like, are these the same thing? Are these things with different levels or something like that?
You mean in terms of like pleasure, ecstasy, bliss?
Yeah, like are these words mean the same thing? Are there differences between them? Are there kind of levels? So I thought maybe we'd talk about that a little bit,
Sure.
right? So I just did a little bit of words for happiness in Sanskrit just to see what they say about this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they said sukha, they kind of put a little bit lower. So they
Yeah.
kind of talked about that being sort of more like a fleeting pleasure experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to be quite the same when we get to the Tibetan Tantra stuff. It's a little bit different. So that
Yeah.
was interesting for me. And then they use a word called santosha, I guess, which
Yeah.
means something like more of a contentment thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Contentment, exactly.
And then they had one that was mudita, which is kind of a little bit more has the connotation of a spiritual happiness, which I'm very interested in that concept as we go along, even though I might not use this exact language. So does that word speak to you? Is that something you hear a lot?
And that's not something I hear a lot. No, I mean I've heard it
Okay.
before, but it's not something that I
Yeah,
use
yeah, yeah.
in, like if I'm teaching class or anything like that. So
I just thought it was interesting because there is kind of a stagingness of this, and that was something that the listener was kind of talking about. So you do get that idea, even
yeah.
though it may not be exactly the way I think about it. I just wanted to present it to folks so you can decide for yourself.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then,
Yeah, they
yeah,
framed it in this particular kind of like step by step sort of
yeah.
pleasure, ecstasy, bliss. Like, are they, is it a, I mean, they were asking, is this a step by step thing or not? And so we took the question we framed the question in the way that they presented it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So that's why
Yeah.
we're doing it this way. It's not that this is the way, it's just the way that they presented the question. And if I'm looking at it, I think like let's, because we're in our sexual series now, right? With the Karma Mudra, we did Karma Sutra before a little bit. Um, Pleasure is something that is akin to like um foreplay, I guess we could say.
Or you want to do it like in the kind of the levels of intensity of feeling. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes. Okay. Um, and then ecstasy obviously is the, for me anyways, it's not just the peak orgasm, it's the moments before, like it's not just play. Of course, pleasure is the base of all of it, right? Um, and then ecstasy is kind of like the state that is the kind of like apex of the peak, if you will, right? It's not just the tip of the peak, it's the top, you know, if we're using a bell-shaped curve, right? It's like the top round, the top part of the bell, right? And then, but then it's not a curve, actually. It doesn't, because it doesn't come down. Bliss, at least in my perspective, levels off just below kind of like an ecstatic state, and it's stable. So it no
Hmm.
longer has these kind of like ripples, if you will. It doesn't have these peaks and troughs, but it's a very high kind of place. And bliss comes from change. Again, my interpretation of it,
Uh-huh.
that those things build on each other, that you have to have pleasure regularly in order to prime you for ecstatic experiences. for peak experiences of
Yeah,
any
because you're
type.
going to like ecstasy is this exploding peak experience thing. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, but you have to prime yourself to this. You have to you have to prepare the ground, right? Which is ground path result, right?
Hmm.
In a sense. And so the path is the kind of like the path of ecstasy, right? And so so the more that you get into those states, the deeper that you can experience them, the more sensual you become, the more you sort of, I don't want to say leave the mind, but you access different pieces of it such that you can be in these states for longer periods, and they are changing you. They're changing your nervous system. They're changing I mean, they're literally changing your auric field. They're changing your electromagnetic field around you. We could say physiologically, why? Well, your heart rate is changing, your heart rate variability is changing, your respiration is changing, your blood pressure is changing, the hormones that are getting released are changing, and all those are having a cascade effect on your physiological body. Simultaneously, you are an electromagnetic being, so you are then changing your electromagnetic resonance, right? And then those things are going and working in tandem to create a different kind of experience for one who is practicing in this way.
So for you, so I don't use these words in this way. So I'm cool with the words being used in that way. When I saw that trio of words, they didn't have a specific meaning to me like the way you're doing with it. So I think
Yeah.
it's cool. So the way you're framing it though is like the bliss, the thing that's sort of the part that gets more enduring and more transformative. Is that's how you're
Yes.
thinking of it? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm cool with that. Um, so okay, so then this kind of bliss is like maybe that's the Ananda, because they do
Yes.
like a four-part thing. They go, okay, well, there's this Sukha thing, which in this case is pretty fleeting. The Santosha thing, which is more the contentment,
Hmm.
this Mudita, which is sort of a spiritual happiness, and then finally the bliss, right? Each of these pointing to some different level of happiness or different level of bliss that's happening or something like that,
Hmm.
right?
What is the word in Sanskrit for bliss they give?
Ananda.
Oh, Ananda is the word. Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Got it.
So I was like, when I heard this, the listener's question, I was like, well, let me go back and see like how they use these words, right? And maybe that's helpful, you know.
Hmm.
Because as he acknowledges, there's a translation thing happening here, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, and he does say that. Well, there's translation stuff happening, either from Sanskrit into whatever our languages that we're speaking, right?
Yeah.
So I was like, well, let me at least try to present some of the language around this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably my home base for this is like more of the Buddhist Tantra thing. So I'll just kind of throw that out too, just from the language. But as we talk through it, it'll give a feeling for how these different words are used, right?
Hmm.
It's not a simple question, right? You can answer this in different ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah. So I'm like, when you get to the Buddhist language, you hear less Ananda for whatever the reason is. Or not, that's wrong. You do hear Ananda, and you also hear this thing that they call Mahasukha.
Hmm.
So Mahasukha, Maha is that word that's in Mahayana. If people are familiar with this, we talk about Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle or something. This word
Or
Maha.
Mahamudra.
Mahamudra, the great seal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So this idea of Maha, so you're talking about something like supreme or ultimate,
Yeah.
greater, right? So this is this notion of supreme bliss. And then just to get to this from the point of view of like path, maybe, right? In a lot of the Buddhist tantras, there's this idea of how do you generate these intense states of bliss, either meditatively, using sort of your own sexual feeling for yourself to generate these subjective meditative states without a partner, which is still considered to be practice for when you're going to do this with a partner, right? Part of the Vajrayana. So you learn how
Hmm.
to generate these things in yourself so you can share that with another person, right? In the energetic exchange with someone else. Or of
Hmm.
course you can do this with a partner too, right? When
Yeah.
you're trying to like build this up. And so it's really common to talk about like these four blisses, right? Now, they'll use Mahasukha for the big one, but they do use Ananda sometimes for these stages of this, right? And it depends on like how people decide to translate this for sure. But these are words that are used in both the Sanskrit and then when they end up in Tibetan, right? And so sometimes they'll talk about joy or bliss, right? And then they'll talk about supreme bliss. So the joy they're using is Ananda. They're using that word, right? The same from the Sat-chit-ananda. They'll use so like Paramanda. Paramananda, which is the supreme joy. Now, I know these things more in English. I don't look at these translations that often, but they'll usually say supreme for that. And then they'll say special or extraordinary, which is another Ananda word, Viramananda. And then they do this really last thing, which they call innate. And this is one of my favorite words in like all of this language, which is called Sahajananda, Sahaja. And that gets to the idea of bliss being kind of an innate property of reality, which is part of that thing we were just talking about before, right? So, okay. So they have these ideas, these four levels of bliss, which gets to the idea like, are these things kind of staged? There's a way you can talk about that. But in a lot of the tantras, Buddhist tantras, the ones I'm familiar with, they do this in terms of like activation of different energy centers,
Yeah.
either a meditative thing or through a sexual practice with another person, right? So either you, again, you use your own sexual feeling and energy to generate this, or you can do this with a partner. And in a certain sense, it's probably different strokes for different folks, or what works for you with this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the Vajra Tantra is really big on this, and I think most people say this is the source of this, one of the Buddhist tantras. But it kind of ends up being in a lot of the Tibetan tantric stuff, and the sources back in India and things like that. And so the basic idea of it is it has to do with how either with sexually inspired meditative activity or sexual activity itself, the throat chakra gets activated as if there's almost an imagination of a flow happening from sort of the crown chakra descending down to the throat chakra. And as that energy or that flow downwards hits the throat chakra, there's a feeling of bliss, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
From that chakra going pop,
Yeah.
right? This is actually in Dr. Nita's book too. So we'll get to this stuff even more in detail later on, but sneak preview.
Sneak preview.
Yeah. Actually, Daniel and I will probably do a retreat on
You
this.
you you so you took the words right
Yeah,
out
we're
of my mouth.
planning on doing this. So our
Yeah,
first
yeah.
Jin and Tantra inspired retreat, we're kind of
This
got that in the
this is
works.
happening, and
Yeah.
and I could speak from experience. It's doable. You know,
Hmm.
even a lug like me.
Gonna get these nice feelings. Yeah.
Yes,
So,
for
so
sure.
there's sort of like as the flow goes down and hits the throat chakra, there's a bliss thing that
Hmm.
happens, right? That they'll call bliss. When it hits the heart chakra, they'll call that supreme bliss, right? So the flow, you imagine it going downwards.
Hmm.
When it hits more, kind of the chakra in the pelvis, you'll get this extraordinary bliss.
Hmm.
And then as it gets to, you know, male physiology assigned male at birth, sort of the tip of the penis, the energy kind of there, you'll get this innate joy, Sahajayanda, Ananda, or, if you're more in a female form or assigned female at birth, different interpretations on that, either like kind of like the G-spot area or maybe clitoral, however you want to frame that, right? There's discussions of that. And it's probably one of those things that you'll find that own special space inside yourself
That's right.
where you think that works.
Right.
Your body, you find it for yourself,
That's
right?
right.
Take charge,
Your
folks.
body, your choice.
Take charge. So there's this whole idea of this downward flow. And if you get involved in doing these Buddhist tantras, you'll do these things every day, right? You'll just kind of go through and either with a partner, or even in your own meditative practice, because it becomes kind of something you learn how to do within yourself, right? It's
Yeah,
not just
definitely.
something with like sexual activity with another person. Awesome, but also awesome to learn how to do it just within your own being,
I mean, Eric, I think
right?
realistically, you should be able to do it on your own before you do it with a partner, really.
I mean, that would be the training.
That would be the
That'd be
training.
the
This
training.
way,
Yeah.
when you do it together, you're both doing the same thing, but with a partner now.
Not with the partner. Yeah. So so the whole idea is this kind of travels downwards in this kind of downward path, and then you kind of have this upward return of this, right? So there's a
Yes.
downward version of these four states of pleasure, bliss, or ananda, and then you kind of get to this upward thing. And then it kind of goes the reverse order. When it hits this sort of more energy center chakra thing, sort of more in the pelvis, you get the bliss thing, the ananda, and then you get the one at the heart, and that still becomes sort of the supreme Paramananda. And then you get to the throat chakra, Varamananda, and then you get the Sahajayana when it hits the crown. So, I mean, if that helps the person who's asking the question, and we're all talking about this just for all of us learning this, there is kind of a yogic path then using this bliss, Now this is the
Yeah.
bliss kind of being a tool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you'll get different language around this, but that Mahasukha thing, that supreme bliss, is like the pop when it hits to that sort of innate feeling of joy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or innate feeling of bliss. And that this word sahaja is so interesting because it has this connotation of innate, which means that when you're inducing this, you're getting kind of an innate feeling of bliss that's innate to reality, sat-chit-ananda, innate to the experience of the truth of things. That's like the underlying thing of reality,
Is that
right?
you mean that is that at the like the at the end of the genitalia, you mean?
I mean, they sometimes put it there, or sometimes they'll put the reverse when it hits the crown chakra. But wherever you generate the version of this, I think they're using the word innate to suggest, or to like, not even suggest, just to say that this is the innate quality of reality when you hit it, right?
Mm,
So on the one hand, it's kind of like a tool, and we could talk about more the tool aspect of it. But when
sure.
you say sahaja, you're saying like innate, right?
Yeah.
An
And
innate bliss.
yeah, I like how, Bobby T, aka Robert Thurman, talks about people, and it's been maybe he's not the only one. I've heard it a little bit more now, but I like to use this kind of language to help to try and empower people to feel like they can get their practice started. That like the state of enlightenment is your birthright.
Hmm.
Like it is absolutely innate. It is so when I hear innate as like natural. This is one's
I
authentic
mean,
state.
there's a connotation of that. Sometimes they'll use the word natural when they translate that into English. That's true. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
like this is the natural state of being. When it's I guess unperturbed, if you will, unsullied with whatever attachment, aversion, ignorance, all the kind of
All the
various poisons. Yeah,
yeah,
all the yuckies,
yeah,
boo, you know.
yeah.
Um And so yeah, so anyways, I have other thoughts, but I'll let you finish this.
Yeah. So I mean, as I was hearing, the listener's question, I was like, oh, okay. So now we got these two words, Ananda and Sukha, being used, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Ananda can be used to describe these kind of four levels of bliss that happen in a kind of a yogic sense, trying to generate these things,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
And so that gives the idea that, oh yeah, there might be different levels of this, but it's also kind of the practitioner, the student, the yogi is being proactive, trying to learn how to induce these things
Mm-hmm.
in themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you get to the idea of innate, they're saying that you're trying to get something that approximates what reality is, right?
Yeah.
Because it's an innate level of bliss to just being itself, right?
Mm.
Bobby T might say something like you're living in this great sea of bliss, we just don't recognize it, or something like that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
because it's innate, right?
Yeah. There, but so that kind of brings me back to the my previous idea of tuning yourself into that. Right. So like so the listener's question was like, is this a key to the path? Is this a part of the path or is it a byproduct of the path? And I think the answer is yes to all of them.
Yes.
The answer is yes to all of them.
Yeah, that seems true to me too.
Yeah, and maybe we've touched on it, but maybe not in a succinct fashion, but in a succinct kind of fashion. Yes to all of them because it's required. So it's required to bring you back to practice such that you want to do something that feels good. So you will show back up. It doesn't matter. The most disciplined person, few and far in between, but there's some people who are very, very disciplined and can take themselves very high levels of athleticism, very high levels of academia or artistic creativity or whatever, based solely on discipline. Solely on discipline. Of course, there's some divine influence. I know this, but like I'm going to just say discipline. But for this particular conversation and what we're talking about, as we have been in the kind of throes of the Tantra part of Jin and Tantra, that this is the path of bliss. That's what this specific thing is. And so, in using pleasure as a means to get you into the path, yes, it's required as kind of a a key to the path, again, goes back to the ecstasy uh, discussion from a little bit ago. Those peak experiences expand your capacity for, I believe they expand your capacity for comprehension. They expand the potentiality that you have to embody deeper and deeper states, further and further breaking the chains of conditioning, if you will, right? Conditioning from society, conditioning from humanity, really the conditioning not just from our external surroundings, but of our internal surroundings, i.e., our own limiting kind of beliefs on what a being is or is not, right? And the duality of being, right? This essentially the separation between beings themselves and between from being to environment, you know? And then as a byproduct of the enlightenment state, as a byproduct of the bliss state, in that it alters the way in which that you see things because of your previous experiences, right? The ones that we were just passing up along the path. And so your interpretation, your understanding, and more importantly, your application of your experiences change and shape the way in which that you now teach, change in the shape in which you interact with other people, and more importantly, change the way in which you interact with yourself, which then gets expressed to the rest of the world in your artistic, creative way of living, right? You
Mhm.
shape your reality to view more of it how you perceive it to be. And therefore
Mhm.
you surround yourself with different kind of things, different paintings, different people, different kinds of music, different settings and things like this. It changes you. So
So
these are my thoughts.
it kind of goes back to what you're talking about before, though, because as you're doing this, you're kind of rewriting your inner being, right? Now you can frame that in terms of like the physical nervous system, which you were doing, right?
Hmm.
Different hormones, different ways that the brain is going to rewire itself under the influence of these experiences and so on. And you can also frame this in terms of like the subtle nervous system of, the yogis, right? The
Yeah,
chakras and the channels and these all more subtle things, they start to like reframe and rewrite themselves.
totally.
And so that gets to the listener's point too. You're trying to learn how to do that. So you're
Yes.
using these bliss experiences that you're trying to generate using the tools of the subtle nervous system, right?
Yeah.
These subtle channels that are going to get activated as this flow happens up the central channel, right? And you're having those bliss experiences, but they're also rewriting how you experience yourself, right?
Hmm.
And then, I mean, I think what you're also saying, if I hear you right, is you're getting the psychological benefits of that in a way, right? I'm going to
Absolutely.
feel more authentically me,
Yes.
feel, and that's kind of like we go back to our psychology, that's kind of our Carl Rogers thing. I'll
Hmm.
feel more authentically the best version of me somehow.
Yeah.
And that's a good
Yeah.
feeling,
Yeah.
right? As my own individual psychological nature feels good about who I am, right? I'll also feel maybe creative and inspired. And that kind of reminds me of the Wilhelm Reich stuff, right? Because I get
Totally.
myself more straight, I'll feel again those feeling I can love more, I can create more, I want to do more things. I feel like I want to be a proactive force in the world, right? In a good
Hmm.
way.
Hmm.
And the argument is like that's core to who we are. That's innate.
This is innate.
Yeah.
Yes.
When you really hit the ground of who people are, they're much more like that rather than how sometimes we appear to be to one another, right?
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
then, if you get to the Carl Jung of it, all of a sudden you have expansiveness of consciousness and you can perceive more, right?
Yes.
Within yourself and in the world around you. So, anyways, you can kind of frame this in different ways. It's all for the good,
Yeah.
right? But the tool is the bliss thing. And I've said it in different episodes, but when I was going to do Zen, I mean, that's kind of badass, right? Zen's tough. Zen, you're doing like a trial thing. But I realized as I was doing that, there were a lot of bliss states in there. And I had the thought that you were talking about, like, well, on the one hand, I had the thought maybe my inner tantrika speaking out as I was doing the Zen practices, like, now this bliss is inherent to reality, inherent to who I am inside
Hmm.
myself. Both of those things are true, right?
Hmm.
My authentic self is bliss, and reality around me is bliss. So fuck it, I should be working on that.
Yeah.
And that was both a tool to keep going, right?
Yeah.
Whoops, my phone is doing something. That's my mommy.
Mm.
Um, and then on the other hand, the feeling of that's the ground state. And
Yeah.
sometimes in the tantras and Vajrayana Buddhist tantra, they'll say it's the path of bringing the result into the path.
Yes. Yes.
You
Yes.
try to
Yes.
bring the bliss, the resultant state, into the path, and then they
Hmm.
fold into one another, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you're kind of collapsing the story in a way. I'm like bringing the end result. I'm already meditating that during the path stage, right?
Yeah.
And I'm trying to use the tools to get to that. All right, cool. I guess we probably covered it, but I'll kind of share my little bit of experience over the break. And there's other stuff to add into this, when I was doing my little retreat. So I was working on kind of two tantras specifically, one called the Guhya Garbha, the secret essence, and the other called the Guhya Samaja, the secret assembly. So those were the ones I was studying. That wasn't the main practice I was doing, but they're sort of like the teaching tantras, right?
Yeah.
And they fit into the meditations I was doing.
Yeah.
And the one thing that hit me in the reader's question was, and the listener's question was that the nature, like the Guhya Garbha Tantra, this secret essence talks about experiencing kind of that ground of being again, kind of
Mm.
that sat-chit-ananda thing. And it basically says that the ground of being is purity, or the ground of being is the mandala, or the ground of being is, in this case, bliss, right? So, part of that is you use the different states of bliss to sort of approximate that experience of hitting that ultimate state, that ananda or that mahasukha thing or that sahajayana thing, right? The sahaja thing. Yeah, the sahaja ananda thing, where you use that as like a tool to keep kind of approximating yourself towards that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think the Buddhist tantras do a pretty good job of like trying to describe that. You may not hit that state immediately or something, but as you get more into this ability to, I think what you were saying, tolerate stronger states of bliss within the nervous system of who you are, tolerate
Yes.
more expansive states of consciousness, you're getting closer and closer to that thing. There's probably more to say about that, but in that tantra and in the commentary I was reading about that, they make that point. The bliss then becomes sort of a tool for this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Approximating what this touchdown feeling will feel at the end, or goal if you happen to be more in a soccer country.
Nah, nah. Well, we're not.
The listener might be, I don't know. So whatever it is, but I like that. It seems very true to me, this idea that you're approximating this feeling, you get closer to
Mm-hmm.
it as you go. I think that's always made a certain sense to me, and the closer you get, that's the feeling of, what do you want to call it? The ground of being, Sahaja, Brahma, God, Allah, Adonai, the light of the endless, the Tao. That always seemed truth to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? So in that sense, it's kind of a goal, but then a tool along the way. And then in the other one I was working on, you got more on that, Daniel? I don't know. I was kind of, let me leave
Well,
space
I'm just saying, like
a little bit after some more part to add, but yeah.
all of these practices that are moving you towards a state of bliss, right? So, pleasure, ecstasy, bliss, in the way that we framed it earlier, but that are moving you towards the state of bliss, which is, maybe I can maybe say it a little bit differently, a little bit more expansively, in the state of positive change, a state of being in continual positive change is done, and because I know our time is wrapping here a little bit, is done in order, not in order, but in part because of the place that we are doing it in is one of great suffering. So we began this conversation, or at least I brought this into it. I don't know if I can say we began it, but I brought this up to say that we are doing this during a period of great tumult. And that is not to say that, again, we are exclusionary in our views of this. It is to say that we are intentionally inclusionary. I don't know if that's a word, but it is now, of this practice in that period. So essentially, there's a book by the guy who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, is
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
maybe Bach, Jonathan Bach or something
Jonathan
like
Bach. Yeah, I think that's right.
yeah. And I forgot is the Reluctant Messiah, short read, good read. But in it there's just like some random quotes. And essentially what you're doing is, in my mind, is this. In that book, there's a quote that says what the caterpillar calls the end of the world, the master calls a butterfly. And
Mm.
so there still is other caterpillars while butterflies exist. And so in this practice, in this on this trajectory, which takes multiple lifetimes, there are plenty of other caterpillars that exist even as you're in the process of becoming this said butterfly and then hopefully creating a butterfly effect, but a positive one, not a tornado in Kansas when a butterfly flaps
Yeah.
its wings in Thailand. You know what I'm saying? And that you're doing this in the midst of the suffering that you're surrounded in the middle of this kind of like yuck fest, if I could use that language. In our, you're changing yourself in the middle of all this discomfort because that's the only place that you can do it on a consistent basis. Of course, you have opportunities in the bardo and stuff like this in the moments before death or whatever, but this is this is the substrate that we have to operate within. And so we're not operating in a place of ignorance to say, oh, everything is perfect. No, it's not. But life is this a point that you made to me, Eric, a long time ago, actually, a couple of years ago, when talking about some regular life stuff. You were like, life is coming. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter what you're doing. Life is coming anyways. So you're either going to be prepared for it or you're not. So the choice is I mean, at least for you and I and for probably our listeners, is obvious. The choice is obvious. It's do it. It's we're doing it.
Yeah, I made this deal with myself back in the day when I first started doing this in my 20s, which was like, okay, I'm not going to resign from the world. I don't know if you even can, because even if you run off to some monastery, you're still going to have to deal with the people in the monastery or the nunnery, and maybe they're jerks, and you know, like there's no way around it, kind of on some
Yeah.
level, right? You're going to
Yeah.
exist within this reality. So I thought, well, okay, well, I'm going to have to like take care of business in the reality, whatever that means in terms of our own individual lives. And that I might have something, I got probably another 15 minutes maybe to do this because there's a couple more things left to say.
Sure.
But I knew that was going to be a thing, but I thought I can't get off of this particular thing either. I got to stay on this course. I can't lose that, you know? And maybe that's something we all can figure out how to handle and like how we'll try to do that. And I've been pretty consistent with it over the years, but I thought, okay, if I have to deal with the things of the world, I got to, but I'm not losing like my trajectory of this spiritual practice. I'm not going to do that. And that's the deal I made with myself, that where you negotiate with yourself. I'm going to keep myself honest with this. Eric, keep yourself honest on this point, which I've tried to do. So, anyways, yeah, yeah, yeah. I never thought we'd bring up Jonathan Livingston Seagull. My dad used to listen, there's a Neil Diamond album, which I'm sure Daniel has never heard in his life. That's just the Jonathan Livingston Seagull, like the album,
Oh wow.
where the guy does Neil Diamond does the whole story, I guess. I don't even know what the story of that thing is, but like there's all these kind of Neil Diamond songs
Oh wow. I didn't even know.
that my dad would belt out in the car. I
Yeah.
am, I said to no one there. All right, whatever.
Yeah.
My daddy. So, okay, the other big one was Guya Samaja, right? So the one is talking more about sort of the innate bliss nature of things. Guya Samaja uses bliss in maybe a different way, or some of the Dalai Lama school tantras talk a little bit more like this, right? And in the Dalai Lama school, this secret assembly tantra, this Guya Samaja, is one of their main ones that they think kind of capture the heart of what tantra is about. Different ways of thinking about that, but that's the one that's the big one in the Dalai Lama school. And the idea there is that the bliss becomes part of a process that taps you into your own deepest self. So they talk about it in that way that the nature, your own deepest nature, whether you call that Buddha nature or your original Shen or whatever you want to call it, right? That core of who you are is pure light, bliss, emptiness, right? This kind of core of who you are. And the Daniel above Daniel, the Eric above Eric, the listener above listener, or something, the core of who we are is that. So that this becomes a tool to realize that. They also talk about it in kind of, again, in an energetic way and how it like works through the subtle energetic anatomy of the body, these chakras and channels, that eventually the bliss state allows things to dissolve, like all those energies to dissolve back into the heart channel, is usually how this is talked about.
Mm-hmm.
That heart channel can pop open. And when that heart channel pops open, it's a liberative experience.
Liberative.
Liberative,
Liberative. Yes.
liberative experience to
Yeah.
the deepest part of who you are.
Yes.
So they try to do it that way too, if that helps the listener out or anyone who might be interested in this, right? It kind of tries to do that. And then there's this moment of recognition that happens where you go, wait a minute, this is my deepest nature. Holy fuck, this is the deepest nature of everything too.
Yeah.
And then the two things collapse together. And sometimes they'll call that like water pouring into water, right? The two, what feels like the inside pours into the outside and vice versa. There's a collapse of that. And there's this feeling everything is kind of bliss, which I know is really hard when things are fucked up, right? It's hard to feel that feeling. You look at the world and you're like, what am I seeing here? I remember Bob Thurman talking about this back in the day, like lectures he did during the Iraq War, you know,
Mm-hmm.
around the 9/11 times. And he's like, well, how can I feel this as bliss? Bombs are falling, on these, mostly, innocent people, that are just stuck in the way of these things, and all of these things are happening that are so off, how can I feel bliss when, Dick Cheney's in the White House directing all these terrible, neocon political things, right, that are so destructive in the world, or however you want to frame those questions, right, for yourself. And like, I think we all wrestle with that, but it's something, I guess, that's underneath that or something. I think that's where the being part, for me, of the sat-chit-ananda part comes in. It's a being aspect, it's the ground of reality. Even if other things look fucked up, the being of things at the core has this blissful quality. But I don't think that's easy. And I'm glad you brought that point up. I think that's a wrestling match, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're like, how do I feel bliss when there's so many things that are screwed up? Why would
Yeah.
I say this is bliss? And relatively speaking, it doesn't seem that way. That's true.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's any way to deny that, right? But it's more something that's like at the core of reality or something, or like the ground of reality, or whatever phrase speaks to you. You're trying to
Right.
tap into that feeling,
Right.
right? Even though things, relatively speaking, might be very, very ugly, and unjust and violent and, humiliating and disrespectful, or whatever litany of adjectives you want to put on there,
Mm-hmm.
violent, destructive. Yeah. Well, that seems like it's a closer.
I think
But
so.
okay, you want to leave it? Okay, then maybe we have one other little mini follow-up. We'll talk about one other thing, which I think I want to just, when the listener was asking the question, I thought, okay, so how do you think about pleasure, everyday pleasures, and how does that fit into the path? But to be continued, I
Yeah.
suppose, right? Because I think it's another part of the answer to the question, at least to my mind.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm glad you brought that thing up, though, about it's hard, to like see it that way, right?
Yeah.
Especially in times like now when things seem so chaotic and yeah, there's so much wrong, right?
Mm-hmm.
It can be painful, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's and there's almost a risk, I guess it could even seem offensive or something. How can you tell me this is bliss? That's fucking rude,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like you could feel all kinds of range of feelings like that. And I know people who do. Like I'm thinking as we're talking of people I
Yeah,
know who
totally.
care a lot about the world, care a lot about the injustices of the world.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's a righteous feeling, honestly.
Yeah. But again, I think from this point of view, it's something more about not the bullshit that people are doing,
Mm-hmm.
but something more at the ground of being, that it's at the core of reality.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
the promise of the spirituality, I suppose. And then you can share it. And hopefully we can all find it at some point and we won't have to like, we'll have less of this, right? And ultimately none.
That's the hope.
That's the spiritual hope.
That's the hope. Well, Eric, as always, thank you so much
Thank you, Daniel.
for doing this. Thank you to our listener who shall remain nameless but knows exactly who they are and where they're from. For bringing this to us. This is a really great discussion. It definitely helped me personally clarify some of my own thoughts. So we're grateful to them for writing this email. And for other people, if you have a question that we look at everything that we get, but we'll address it specifically like this. So please feel free. Um, Leave a comment or a question in the comment section of the YouTube videos, or hit us up at ginandtantra@gmail.com, or on the Instagram, the Gin and Tantra Podcast. We are listening and observing. Like, comment, subscribe, share our work. This is a labor of love. We are sponsored by ourselves. So, the more love that you give, the more that we receive, and we give it back to you. And it's just an endless cycle of, goodness and wholesome. Good stuff. Anyways, for Eric,
Wholesome Jimmy Chandra.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Of pleasure. It's a wheel of pleasure.
Yeah.
One that I hope to stay on as long as possible. So, for Eric, this is Daniel. We'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.